Boa tarde. Não está muito alto? Não. Então, em nome do CIES, Centro de Investigação e Estudos de Sociologia do ISCTE, através do Observatório da Imigração e da Rede Migra, gostaríamos de agradecer, em primeiro lugar, a presença do Sr. Secretário de Estado das Comunidades Portuguesas, aqui ao meu lado esquerdo, Dr. José Cesário, bem como o apoio que deu para tornar esta conferência possível. Gostaríamos também de agradecer a presença do Sr. Secretário de Estado Adjunto, do Ministro Adjunto e do Desenvolvimento Regional, Dr. Pedro Lomba, também aqui à minha esquerda. On remercie également Frédéric Docquier, professeur de l'Université Catholique Louvain, portanto, aqui o conferencista. Agradecemos também a presença de todos aqui. A Cláudia vai começar por uma breve apresentação do professor Frédéric e, posteriormente, o Dr. José Cesário vai também fazer uma breve introdução. Obrigada.
Boa tarde a todos. Eu vou agora mudar para inglês. Good afternoon, Professor Frédéric Docquier. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. This conference, as Inês told, is funded by the Secretary of State for Portuguese Communities, Dr. José Cesário, to whom we thank, and by the General Directorate for Consular Affairs and Portuguese Communities, to whom we thank, to its Director Ambassador João Maria Cabral. It is co-organized by Immigration Observatory of CIES and Rede Migra also of CIES. The Immigration Observatory belongs both to CIES and to DGACCP, the General Directorate for Consular Affairs. And our aim is to have accurate data on Portuguese abroad. So we asked every statistical institute of the destination countries of the Portuguese, for instance, the Statistical Institute of Belgium, how many Portuguese live there and how many went in the last year. And we try to do this with every statistical institute of each destination country of the Portuguese, so that we may know how many Portuguese live each year. We also have other data in the website of Immigration Observatory, such as the Consular records, scientific publications on Portuguese immigrants, and other data. Rede Migra, Migra Network, our aim was to concentrate the researchers who focus on Portugal as a destination and origin country of migrants. So we wanted to concentrate the researchers' work on Portugal in the University of Porto, University of Nova, other universities, so that we may know what each is doing. But now it has extended to researchers from other countries and other topics. So now we are 170 researchers from 15 different countries, and it was co-funded by Joana Azevedo and by me. We also intend to promote contact with governmental officials, so that there is contact between the academy, governmental officials, and private institutions. And I will now introduce briefly Professor Frédéric Docquier. He is a research assistant at the National Fund for Economic Research. He is Professor of Economics at the University Catholique de Louvain, and he holds a PhD in Economics from the University de Marseille. His research interests are economic growth and international migration, and these were the main reasons why we invited him, so that we could see in a worldwide picture what are the several implications between economic growth and international migration. He has been consultant for the World Bank since 2004, and the statistics that he publishes are widely used and quoted. Just he has a recent one on the statistics of the Institute for the Employment Research, where we can see in 20 destinations countries of the OECD how many immigrants are there and the education level. For instance, in Portugal, we may consult that brain data statistic. How many immigrants since 1980, every 5 years, how many immigrants are in Portugal, what is their educational level, and the gender. This is only one of the widely quoted statistics of him. He has published several papers and edited 4 books, and one is Brain Drain and Brain Gain, the global competition to attract skilled migrants. And today he will give a global view on the projections of population, income, education level, and international migration over the 21st century. Thank you very much. And now I will pass the word to Dr. José Cesário.
Muito obrigado. Meu caro Pedro Lomba, Sr. Diretor-Geral, Monsieur Frédéric Docquier, minhas caras amigas, eu cumprimento todos os investigadores, professores presentes, é com muito gosto que aqui estou, uma vez mais, para participar num debate sobre esta magna questão das migrações portuguesas. Foi exatamente neste ano, 2014, que nós sentimos o dever de, pela primeira vez, publicar um relatório da imigração portuguesa. A sua elaboração deveu-se a um conjunto de contribuições, muito particularmente do Observatório da Imigração, dos investigadores que participam no Observatório da Imigração e, evidentemente, da nossa Direção-Geral dos Assuntos Consulares e Comunidades Portuguesas. Fizemos-lo porque temos plena consciência da dimensão do fenómeno migratório na nossa realidade atual, na história presente e na história de Portugal desde sempre. Nós temos neste exato momento cerca de 2.300.000 portugueses nascidos em Portugal que vivem no exterior do país. Num universo que as diversas organizações internacionais estimam entre 215, 216 e 230 milhões de imigrantes que há em todo o mundo, nós temos, portanto, sensivelmente 1% de nascidos em Portugal. Temos de lhe juntar um universo enorme de pessoas, uma quantidade enorme de pessoas, já nascidas de fora de Portugal, que partilham connosco a nacionalidade, a cultura, a língua. Se fizermos projeções, não é difícil concluir que aquele milhão de portugueses que saiu de Portugal em direção ao Brasil entre 1890 e 1930 terá originado no mundo de hoje, no Brasil de hoje, qualquer coisa como cerca de 40 milhões de pessoas. Isto diz, portanto, bem da realidade deste fenómeno. Um fenómeno que tem, evidentemente, tido altos e baixos. Aqui há uns anos atrás, não muitos, quando eu exerci estas funções pela primeira vez, há 12 anos, era comum ouvir-se dizer que Portugal já não era um país de imigrantes. Evidentemente que nós, quem conhece a realidade das migrações portuguesas, sabia que não era assim. Sabia que nós nunca deixámos de ser um país de pessoas que sempre partiram. Partiram por necessidade ou partiram por opção. E hoje partem mais, como partem mais de outras origens, também por necessidade, mas também por opção, porque a realidade hoje do mercado de trabalho tem muito a ver com a economia aberta que temos hoje a nível global, completamente globalizada. E, portanto, isto é um desafio para todos nós. É um desafio para cada um dos cidadãos que vive neste mundo, para nós em particular que vivemos neste país, e é um desafio para as nossas instituições. É um desafio para a escola, é um desafio para a administração pública, é um desafio para o poder político, é um desafio para quem investiga, é um desafio para quem, de alguma forma, tem de planear ou encarar o futuro. É um desafio para as empresas, é um desafio para todos aqueles que pensam o amanhã. É por isso que estas reflexões são reflexões muito importantes. Nós temos procurado fazê-las num contexto que é um contexto muito alargado, articulando a nossa experiência a nível da nossa imigração com a nossa experiência a nível da nossa imigração, no contexto, portanto, das migrações, e por isso é com muito gosto que colaboramos e que estamos presentes em mais esta iniciativa, evidentemente com, neste caso, um especialista que nos ajudará, com certeza, a construir um pouco uma análise cada vez mais exigente daquilo que é, portanto, a realidade migratória no mundo de hoje, no nosso caso concreto, a realidade migratória portuguesa. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigada.
On passe maintenant la parole.
On va dire 55 minutes, mais si je dois arrêter plus tôt, il n'y a pas de problème. Yeah, so it seems that the floor is mine. Claudia, I can start? Okay, so first I would like to thank Claudia for the invitation and the rest of the team here for the nice words to say about me. And well, that's a pleasure to be back to Lisbon. I came here just 5 months ago for a seminar in the other university, in Nova University, so it's always a pleasure to come back here. As you see, the title of my presentation is Income Disparities, Population, Migration Flows over the 21st Century. So the title clearly indicates that there will be a prospective dimension in this presentation, but not only a prospective dimension. There will be 2 parts, in fact, in this presentation. One part will be an overview of the migration debates in rich countries. What do the data reveal on immigration? What do academic studies show on immigration? And idem on immigration. What do we know about this? Inevitably, when a professor or researcher gives you an overview, he gives you partly his own view of the literature. So inevitably, this view will reflect my reading or my own understanding of this literature. But I would be happy to debate with you about that. The second part of the presentation will be on projections. So I will provide you with worldwide projections of income disparities, education levels, population disparities, and migration flows for the 21st century. And worldwide means that I will not consider the world as a single entity, but I will provide projections by country, so including Portugal, for example. And I want to make it clear from the beginning that you should not take these projections as forecasts of the world economy. Can you see anything? Not forecast of the world economy. My colleagues in Louvain told me several times that, forecasting a country over 6 months or 12 months is already a very complex task. So you can understand that forecasting 200 countries over 1 century is clearly an impossible task. Okay, so the goal of that part will be to provide simulations of the trajectory that the world economy could follow over the 21st century under some reasonable or plausible set of hypotheses, so plausible scenarios. And instead of forecasting, which is not the goal here, my goal is to identify the key factors, the key hypotheses that will govern the future of the world economy and the future of migration flows. Can we identify them? And contrary to the first part, to the overview, this will require a model, a projection model, and I will not describe this model technically today, but we argue in the paper that the existing models that you can find in the literature, especially the United Nations model, is probably not the most appropriate model to do that. If you want to project migration flows over the 21st century, you need an integrated model with economic and socio-demographic variables. we have a huge literature in economics analyzing the determinants of migration and showing that the most important determinants are the relative size of nations, in the spirit of the gravity model, the relative income of nations, the education level of people, because we know that the high-skilled are more migratory than the low-skilled, so we need to be able to predict the evolution of education attainment. And of course, in a short period of 5 years, 10 years, these variables are very sluggish, very stable over time. You are going to tell me, okay, but Portugal was hit severely, like Greece as well as and Spain, by the crisis. It's clear that over a short period, sometimes you have big disparities, increasing or decreasing. But over 1 century, these changes can be very, very important. We saw in the 20th century, or since the Industrial Revolution, that population disparities in the world have increased a lot. And income disparities have increased a lot as well. So we need a projection model which account for that, and which endogenizes education level, population levels, and income levels. And well, I will not be technical today, but my presentation of this will be based on a paper that I wrote with a Portuguese researcher, Joel Machado, who is in Louvain today. So we use quantitative theory. So quantitative theory means that it's not a black box like what the World Bank or the United Nations are developing. It's a very simple, stylized model with a minimum of ingredients in it to understand the interdependencies between the main economic variables and the main demographic variables. The good thing is that we can calibrate the model on the data that we have today. We can force the model by adjusting some parameters to replicate perfectly what we observe today, and then we can simulate it. But that will be for the second part. So this is the roadmap of my presentation. So I will start with this overview of the literature. And in the second part, I will talk just a little about this model, baseline projections, and I will analyze the robustness of these predictions to the hypotheses that we use before summarizing everything. So first, why focusing on migration? We know that the migration debates are more and more passionate, very lively today. Especially immigration in many countries has become a hot topic. So why is it the case? What do people believe about migration? So what are the perceptions that people have? And are these perceptions in line with economic studies? If not, who is right, who is wrong? Okay? And in some countries, emigration is also a source of concern, and emigration has been largely understudied so far. I would say that in the academic literature, 90%, if not more, of the papers are on immigration, and only 10% of the papers on emigration. Why is it the case? First, because emigration is not officially measured. You have just a few countries keeping statistics on emigration, and it's very difficult to trace and to track migrants abroad. You can have statistics about visas, okay? But once people leave the country, what do they become? They can remigrate, they can die, they can change their education level, so the characteristics can change. They can change their gender, which is rarely the case, but it could happen, okay? So the characteristic could change a lot, okay? And it's very difficult to trace this. So that's one of the reasons why it has been understudied, and the approach that we follow here is very similar to what you are doing in the center. We collect data at destination in plenty of destination countries. In our database, we collect data from all the countries of the world, more or less, okay? And we aggregate this data to build indicators of immigration. This is what you do, I think, also in this center, at least for Portugal. The second reason why it has been understudied is that immigrants are much less visible. Immigrants, you know where they are, and usually they concentrate in cities or in the suburbs, so it's very easy to identify them and sometimes to treat them as the scapegoat in terms of downturn or economic crisis. When people are leaving the countries, they are not visible anymore. They disappear from the country. So it's more difficult, and it's hardly the case that they are seen as the scapegoats for economic problems. While we will see that sometimes the economic, and for many countries, the economic effects of emigration are more important than the economic effect of immigration. But besides these two problems, we see that more and more people are concerned with emigration, and emigration is more and more seen as a source of cost for the origin country. So we'll try to understand why as well, but you know very well this reason, I think. Let's start with immigration. Oops, it's the other way around. Okay, so immigration is our topic. Why? I think it's just a question of data. The UN data shows you that the number of migrants has increased from, let's say, 90 million in the 60s to 220 million in the recent years. But as percentage of the world population, this percentage has been very, very stable. This is the curve here. You don't see the colors maybe on the screen, but this is the curve here. This is the world migration rate, 3% more or less, at least if you correct for the split of the ex-Soviet Union, Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia. Otherwise, you would have just a flat curve, and then after 1990, a break, and then a flat curve as well, okay? So you could say, where is the problem? This proportion is very stable. The problem is that the distribution of these migrants is very heterogeneous. And if you focus on high-income countries, what I call the North here, you see that the proportion of immigrants that we have in the North has increased from 4.6 on average to almost 11%. And this is this bold curve, which is strongly increasing. So we have more and more immigrants relative to our population. Where are they coming from? Not from the North. North-North migration, this is this dotted curve. Very flat, very stable over time. South-North migration, so the proportion of people coming from the South and living in the North today, as proportion of the population of the North, 1.5 to 8%. So a big increase. This is the dashed curve here, which is parallel to the global immigration rate, or the average immigration rate of high-income countries. So we see that we have more and more people coming from economically distant countries, culturally distant countries, and this is what people perceive. Okay? But this is an average of all the high-income countries in the world. Is this average representative of all the countries? More or less, yes. Here you have the proportion of immigrants in the main destinations, EU 15, USA, Canada, Australia, and I put Portugal in bold, and the number that the UN is producing, I think, are a bit overestimated. I don't know what are the sources of data that they use for Portugal, but they estimated that in Portugal today you have 8% of migrants, which is, I think, slightly above the reality. But still, you see that everywhere, you see this proportion of immigrants increasing. This is a common phenomenon. And the proportion of immigrants coming from the South is also increasing. Okay? And all these data, all these statistics are based on legal migration, people that you can find in the census. And some could say, okay, but what about illegal migration? For illegal migration, by definition, we do not have precise estimates. It's something which is very difficult to estimate. But there is a center in Germany, Clandestino, or a project in Germany, Clandestino, which has estimated a lower bound and an upper bound for immigration. And if you take for Portugal, for example, the estimate of the UN, which is probably overestimated, you add what they have estimated for illegal migration, it adds 1 percentage point. So it's not big, but it's not peanuts as well. But usually the cross-country variability in immigration rate is perceived, is maintained if you add illegal migration. So illegal migration does not add a lot to the picture. Okay? So first message, immigration, and especially South-North migration, has increased everywhere. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? We have a large, but very large literature on the welfare impact that immigration has on natives. When you ask people in the street, this is what we have in the opinion polls that are conducted, a World Value Survey or International Social Survey program, when you ask people in the street, what do you think about immigration? People say, in general, they are taking our jobs away, they are reducing our wages, they create a fiscal burden. So people are very pessimistic about the effect that immigration has on the economy. Economists disagree with that. Even the most pessimistic economists will say the effect is very small. And the majority of economists are saying that the effect is small and presumably positive. We know that immigration generates winners and losers. The winners are probably the capitalists and workers who have complementary skills with migrants. And the losers are workers who have substitutable, the same skills as migrants. But from the standard labor market model, the surplus theory says that the gain for the winners exceeds the loss for the losers. So there is a surplus of immigration. If we could redistribute this surplus, it could be a Pareto improving situation. Everybody could be better off. But we do not have this redistribution tools. Okay? So there might be some losers. And again, the presumption that people have is that the losers are the less educated, the most vulnerable people, because they have this idea in mind that immigration is typically an entry of low-skilled people. Maybe it was true in the past, but the data that we have collected, the census data that we have collected, show that over the recent period, the 90s or the last decade, immigrants are obviously younger than natives, than the whole population, and slightly more educated, even in countries where these guys are coming from the south. And so the labor market effects of immigration are usually positive, even for the low-skilled. This is something that many economists have found, and which goes against the presumption that you can find in the opinion surveys. There are plenty of studies on the fiscal impact of migration, and because the main determinant of this fiscal impact is the age of people. Immigrants are younger, they are much more likely to be net contributors to the welfare state and to public finance, and still, in plenty of analytical studies and economic studies, you find that the effect on the fiscal, on the budget, is very small and positive. And other economists have shown that you have other effects, like the market size effect. Immigration increases the demand for goods and services. It may have an effect on entrepreneurship, on the varieties, the diversity of goods in the society. So economists are claiming that these effects are small. Again, they are very small, but positive on average. Okay? So who is right, who is wrong? People believe that it's very bad. Economists are saying that it's small and presumably positive. As an economist, I have a tendency to say that we have the good statistics and we have some serious tools to study that. Maybe I'm wrong, but one thing I would like to say is that if you ask the same people in the same opinion polls, the guys who are saying it's very bad, how many migrants do you think we have in the society today, in the population today? In Europe, they say 24%. On average, we have 10%. In the US, they say 35%. They have 16%. In Canada, they say 38, 39. They have 19%. So people overestimate a lot the size of immigration, and it's not the number of illegal migrants which can justify that. So we think that we have maybe a part of truth in our hands. Does it mean that economists are recommending to open the borders and to have much more migrants? No, the only thing that we say is that we dislike the discourse which says that the economic arguments are the main arguments. We just say that the economic arguments are not good, but maybe there are societal effects which perhaps indirect economic implication which can justify a cost for natives, but not direct effect that you can find on the labor market or in public finance. Okay? There is an increasing literature on crime, the effect of immigration on crime. And you have very ambiguous results, very heterogeneous results, even for the same country. If you compare the ex-Yugoslavian and the Polish people in the UK, you have very different results. Okay? In Italy, you have very different results, depending on the migration wave that you study and the reasons why people left their country. So there is an ambiguity about this effect on crime of immigration. And you are going to like that probably, Ines. Another very renowned economist, Paul Collier, who is in Oxford today, and he was research director of the World Bank a few years ago, is saying that immigration has a negative impact on social capital, okay, on trust. Okay? People trust more people they are similar with, and they trust less people they are dissimilar with. And if trust decreases because you are less altruistic towards immigrants, you trust them less, this can have an impact on investment, global investment, or on the vote of people towards redistribution. If I'm less altruistic towards you, I'm going to vote for less redistribution towards you. And this could have an indirect impact on the welfare of the less educated, those who receive the transfers. So this we do not know at all. Paul Collier has advanced this hypothesis that social capital decreases, but we have no demonstration of that. We have no proof of that, no evidence of that, but this is something we should not neglect and disregard. Perhaps this effect is very important. Okay, so as an economist, we just say we dislike this discourse about the economic effect of migration, but we agree that there could be some societal effect that we cannot measure. But what is pretty clear, what is something that you cannot deny, is the fact that people do not want to have more migrants. The hostility towards immigrants is something very important. Here I give you the result of the International Social Survey Program. So they have asked people in all these countries, college graduates, higher education, let's say, and less educated people, what would you like to do with immigration? Increase immigration a lot, increase immigration a little, keep it constant, decrease a little, decrease a lot. In all countries, at least if you look at the less educated, you see that the majority of people would like to reduce immigration. In France, in Germany, in Portugal, in the United Kingdom, in the USA as well. And the fraction of people who would like to have more migrants is very, very small. Peanuts in Portugal, in France, or in Germany. The things are a bit different for the college graduates. So things are less extreme, but you have more or less the same pattern. There is a very small minority of people who would like to increase migration. More of them would like to have stagnation, but a large proportion would like to reduce it. So clearly there is an increasing hostility. I cannot say increasing, there is a big hostility towards immigrants today at the level of immigration that we have. So the question is, what should we expect for the future? What does the future hold? Should we expect a decreasing migration pressure in the future or an increasing migration pressure of the future? People would not like to have more migrants. So this is an important question for the second part. Okay? What about emigration? Concerns about emigration are increasing. And the main reason is that in virtually all the countries of the world, emigration is positively selected. The best are living more. The more educated are people, the more migratory they are. Okay? You have positive selection, especially in poor countries. I would say that the positive selection rate or the intensity of positive selection increases with poverty. But this is also something you have in rich countries. This is the data that we have collected. So we have collected census data in all the destinations of the world, not only the OECD, but also African countries, the Gulf countries, which are very important for the Middle East, for Pakistan, for India, and so on. We have collected data everywhere in the world and imputed the data for just a couple of countries for which there is no census, but these countries have almost no migrants. Okay? And in the three columns, we look at the stocks in 2000. The stock of college graduates or less educated people abroad. And we divide that by the number of college graduate or less educated people born in the country. So this is the migration rates by education level. Almost everywhere in rich countries, and it's even more pronounced in developing countries, the migration rate of college graduates exceeds the migration rate of less educated people. And if you are more elitist in the way you define what a skilled is, okay? Here, I consider people working in science and technology, researchers in science and technology. I don't have the data for all the destination countries. I just focus on a single destination country, the United States. And I have computed the immigration rate of researchers in science and technology. Okay? You see that almost everywhere where the data exists, this rate of researchers in science and technology, something very important for innovation and productivity growth, this rate exceeds the rate of college graduates to all destinations. You are going to say, but why did you put a star for Portugal? But because for Portugal, we have a lower rate for science and technology, and we have a lower rate for college graduates vis-à-vis the less educated, when we have all these destinations. So positive selection is almost not there, at least if you focus on stocks. I'm not a specialist of Portugal, I want to confess that, but my feeling is that Portugal is a country of old, low-skilled immigration to France, to Luxembourg, to Switzerland, to Germany, to the US, to Canada. And in the stocks that you have here, you have people who have migrated a long time ago. But if you look at the flows, the recent migration, and here recent, it's the 90s, between 90 and 2000, things are very different. The net flow of migrants with college education over the 90s, so it's a flow, it's not a stock, so the numbers are lower because of that, is equal to 7%. And the corresponding flow for the less educated, 1.6. So you see the gap in the 90s, which is not the main period of brain drain, I think, in Portugal. The last decade was even more severe, but the gap in the 90s was already very strong. So in the recent migration episodes, positive selection is very strong in Portugal, but this is something you know probably very well, much better than me. You talked about this data on migration by education level to 20 destinations. And you say Frédéric developed this data. It's not true. So there is a German center, IAB, in Nuremberg, which has used the same methodology, collecting data for 20 destinations, but this includes France, Switzerland, Germany, the UK, Canada, the US, so all the big countries of destination for Portuguese. And they have computed brain drain and low-skilled or high-skilled migration rate in 5 years intervals, okay, from 1980 to 2010. And what you see is that in almost all these important countries, Spain included, but France, Germany, USA, Canada, you see that the brain drain rate has a tendency to decrease. An exception is Portugal after the 90s, which is reflected in my data, but things are even more severe over the last decades. And it's based on stocks, it's not flows, it's based on stocks. And if you compare for Portugal only the immigration rate of college graduates with the immigration rate of less educated people, you think that things are inverted in the last years. And yeah, the trend is clearly on the rise for immigration of college graduates. So brain drain has become, as you know, and this is maybe why you invited me, brain drain is becoming something very important for Portugal. What could be the effect of that? There is an increasing literature on the consequences that positive selection and brain drain has on those left behind, people who do not migrate. I worked a lot on this, and especially on developing countries. And a lot of papers that we wrote with co-authors show that if you lose the best, you lose the most productive. So that's bad for GDP per capita. But you lose also all the externalities related to human capital. Their capacity to become entrepreneur, their capacity to adopt modern technologies or innovate, their fiscal capacity. The high-skilled are contributing more to the welfare state, to the public finance than the low-skilled. So you lose plenty of things. But we wanted to show that you have also positive effects of emigration, of brain drain. If people anticipate the fact that having a diploma increases their probability to be accepted abroad, so they see the diploma, the degree, as a passport to emigration, then people can accumulate more human capital. Okay? And this is a good thing, ex ante. So you have to compare this positive effect ex ante with the negative effect ex post. We say that there is a brain effect, more human capital, and a drain effect, the loss of human capital. And a brain gain could occur. And after migration, you have remittances, return migration, diaspora externalities. Diaspora means that the high-skilled abroad are working for multinationals, for firms, and they are transferring information between countries, and this could decrease the informational cost, the transaction cost, and facilitate trade, FDI, diffusion of technology. All these effects are important for developing countries, but our computations have shown that these effects are lower than these ones. Out of 120 countries, developing countries, we have identified maybe 20 winners with low brain drain rates and 100 losers, countries in which this positive effect cannot compensate totally or invert, the results about brain drain. What about rich countries, high-income countries? These compensating effects are very likely to be low. We have never identified these positive effects in high-income countries. And so you only have this loss of human capital, which is bad for the origin country. So positive selection, brain drain, is detrimental for all, and especially for the less educated who supply complementary skills with the more educated. With two co-authors, Giovanni Perry and Chala Rosden, we have computed the wage impact of emigration, the immigration flows of the 90s, on the wage of Portuguese and people in the other countries. We have ranked countries by a decreasing order of their brain drain rates. So Portugal is not far. Among OECD countries, it's one of the top. Above, you have Mexico, New Zealand, Ireland, Malta, and Cyprus. And we have computed, using the most optimistic range of parameters of the literature, or the most pessimistic one, or the intermediate range of parameters, we have computed the wage loss for Portuguese. And for Portuguese, we have identified, on average, a loss of minus 0.5% of wage. It's not a big deal. It's not very, very large. It means $100 per year, so it's not a lot. For the less educated, Portugal is here, we are between 1% and 1.5%. Let's say $150 to $200 per year. And this is the effect of migration, emigration over the 90s. You know all that migration over the last decade was more important. So this effect is maybe twice as large in the last decade. And this is the effect of a flow. So if this brain drain persists, the effect of the stock could be 3 times larger than this. Okay, so this is really a source of concern, and this is very something important for high-income countries. And again, the question is, what can we expect for the future? Is this brain drain going to increase, to decrease? What can we expect? What does the future hold? Okay, and this is the question I'm going to address now. What can we project in terms of migration? If you want to have official projections, just use the United Nations projections. You will have projections of migration flows. I don't believe they are reliable. What the UN is doing is simplistic. They assume that for projecting population, fertility of all countries is going to converge to the replacement level in the very long run. Mortality rates are going to converge to very low level. So the population of developing countries will shrink. You will have a transition, a demographic transition. And at the same time, in plenty of their scenarios, they assume constant migration flows, which is completely inconsistent with their hypothesis about the population. So there is no interdependency between education and migration, between population growth and migration. So finally, don't use it. Okay? You have another center in Austria producing projections by education level. And they are the first to link fertility, mortality, migration to education. High-skilled people, educated people, have fewer kids. They live longer, and they migrate more. So they use the fertility level by education today, the mortality rate by education today, the migration rate by education today. They assume convergence in education, and they project migration flows. Okay? Why should we have convergence in education level? So all these studies do not anticipate the economic forces that shape migration flows. The link between the economics, the economy, and the demography. So there is no link between demographic convergence, the hypothesis that they use, and economic convergence, what economists have studied abundantly. And we argue that it's not possible to do that. The correlation between demographic variables and economic variables is very, very strong. Look at this. Fertility and income. Very strong correlation. I'm not claiming that fertility affects income or income affects fertility. This is the result of a bidirectional link, but the correlation is very strong. If fertility converges, income should converge. Life expectancy or mortality and income, very strong correlation. If mortality rates decreases and converge, income should converge. Education and income. Here you have data for all the countries of the world in 2000. We call that a cross-country graph. Very strong correlation. If education converges, income converges. And here it's the historical data. I followed 6 or 7 countries, 6 countries from the Industrial Revolution to the recent past. Very strong correlation. Remove the lines country by country, you have a scatter plot like that with almost the same slope. Okay, so there is a clear link between fertility, mortality, education, and income. And what about migration? Income is a key variable to predict migration. Well, there are plenty of ways to show that, but we clearly see that immigration rates are increasing with the level of income of the country. That's natural. And something I like very much is this graph. It will be important for the rest of my presentation. This is the link between the evolution of population in the world and the evolution of migration flows. What the UN is completely ignoring. They predict migration flows independently on the population size of nations. Look at this. Here, I represent the migration stock. In blue, you have high-income countries. So that's the level of immigration of high-income countries. I divide by the level in 1960. So in high-income countries, immigration was multiplied by 3.5. Okay? The immigration stock was multiplied by 3.5. At the same time, population was multiplied by 1.4. And this is why the immigration rate in high-income countries have increased a lot. Okay? So this is very convex. The slope is very large, which means that the phenomenon is accelerating. But if you do the same exercise for the world, the gray curve, we are almost on the 45-degree line. When the population doubles, the migration stock doubles. And this is why we have a constant migration rate at the world level. And if you do that for developing countries, that's the red curve. South emigration on the vertical axis, population of the south, horizontal axis, we are even more on the 45-degree line. So when the population in the south doubles, the volume of emigration from the south doubles. Okay? So, and even in this last period, 2010, you see that this holds. And you have even a small acceleration here, despite the fact that rich countries have more restrictive migration policies. So more and more, we think that migration policies have a very limited effect, and migration is really a supply-driven phenomenon. And this is something very important if you want to understand the future of migration flows. Okay? So, to conclude this first part, the correlation is so strong between economic and demographic variables that what the UN is doing, what the Austrian Center is doing, assuming demographic absolute convergence between countries, is clearly incompatible with what economists have found. Income disparities have diverged, are stronger today than 50 years ago, than 1 century ago, than 2 centuries ago. So we need really to predict income, economic variables, and demographic variables together to have reasonable projections of migration flows, and this is what we do here. Okay? So, model and baseline projections. Just 2 slides about the model. So, very quickly. It's a multi-period model. So it covers the 21st century, and it has all the countries in the world, 195 countries. In each period, you have adult people, and you have high-skilled and low-skilled people. And the adults are deciding whether to acquire higher education or not. So it's the choice of adults to go to college or not to go to college. At least if they got basic education. If their parents did not invest in basic education, which is the case in many developing countries, they have no access to college. Very easy to understand, okay? Then these adults decide to stay in their country or to emigrate. There is a huge literature on that in economics. We take the consensual model of immigration. And once they are abroad, they decide how much to consume, how many kids to have, and what fraction of them to provide with basic education, okay? So these decisions of adults are governing the allocation, the world allocation, and the education allocation of the labor force. We know how many people in each country are educated or not educated after migration. We put that in the production function, and we determine the GDP of the country and the wages in the country. So that's the minimum of ingredients that we need to project migration. Wow, this is how the model works. I'm going to skip this, okay? You want me to elaborate? No. So this type of model requires parameters, and there are plenty of parameters for which in the literature you can find a consensual value. We use them. And then there are many parameters which vary across countries. To fit the fertility rates of the countries, we use the child wage rate, child labor. In economics, if you don't put child labor into a model, you cannot explain why fertility is so large in developing countries. So we use child labor, the parameters of child labor, to fit perfectly the fertility rates of all the countries in the world, and the evolution of child labor to fit the UN high fertility scenario. So we are compatible with the UN fertility scenario. We calibrate the education cost country by country to fit perfectly the structure by education level, basic education or higher education in all the countries of the world. So the model fits perfectly the data. Maybe it's not the good model, but if it's the good model, we fit perfectly the data. We calibrate migration cost in such a way that we fit perfectly the migration matrices. Using this consensual migration technology, I don't show you the equations here. We calibrate the total factor productivity to fit perfectly the GDP of the country. And then we need to estimate the evolution of TFP. TFP is the productivity of the country in general, which reflects institutions, the quality of the infrastructure, and so on. And we do something which is very trivial, very simple. We assume that the growth rate of TFP, variation in TFP divided by the initial level, is a function of the distance to the frontier. The frontier is the USA. So the greater I am from the US, the more I will grow. So there is a convergence force in this model. If I start very low, I converge to the US. But you have also a country fixed effect. If it's negative, this is a divergence force. If it's negative, it means that everything equal, ceteris paribus, I will have a lower growth rate. So you have a convergence force and you have a divergence force. We estimate this model over the period 1980-2000, and we have predictions that the BRICS are converging towards the BRICS. It's Brazil, Russia, India, China. I know some of them are struggling today, but over the last 40 years, they have converged very quickly. The convergent forces have dominated the divergent forces. High-income countries are converging as well, and this is why, personally, my study is not about Portugal, but Portugal is a high-income country, and my model predicts that Portugal is going to converge. You have a crisis today, but this is a bad spell, and in the long run, you will converge. If you look at the data on growth rates from the 80s to 2010, just look at the last line here. Despite the fact that there was a crisis in the 80s, a crisis in the 90s, and a few years of crisis before 2010, despite that fact, if you compute the average growth rate of Portugal over these 30 years, 2.7, like Spain, 2.2 for Greece, and much less for the richest countries of the world. So my model is very optimistic about the forecast of Portugal, okay? In the long run, okay? That means that you can be hit severely by a crisis. This is a short-run cost, which is very important, but the tendency that we observe over the last 40 years, I would say over the Second World War, the post-Second World War period, shows that there is a convergent sign. So when I do long-run economics, I take the long-run trends, and the long-run trend is positive for Portugal. Okay, so convergence in TFP with the US for high-income countries, convergence of the BRICS, I will have a less optimistic scenario later, divergence of middle-income countries, divergence of low-income countries, so the divergence forces are more important than the convergence forces, and as a result of that, slight divergence of Africa. So Africa will diverge, will grow, but grow less rapidly than high-income countries. This is for productivity. And for population, I just replicate what the UN has shown. The share of Africa is going to increase drastically over the next decades. The share of the population in Africa is going to be multiplied by 2.5. And this is what the UN is revealing as well. Something which is very difficult to counteract, okay? So Africa is going to diverge economically, slightly. I will have a more optimistic scenario about Africa. And Africa, in terms of demography, will be bigger and bigger. And this is something very important for us in Europe. Let me skip this part on education. Income ratio with the US. Europe converges toward the US because TFP converges. Asia converges because of China and India. The BRICS are converging. The rest of Asia would not converge. The world will converge because of this as well. You know, China and India, it's 1/3 of the world. Latin America will slightly converge to the US. And Africa will not converge. Almost a flat curve. So their gap with the US, today their income per capita is 10% of the US. It will remain at the same level. The income share of Africa, and this is the result, will stay constant despite the fact that the demographic share of Africa will be multiplied by 2.5 or 3. Okay? And these are very important things for Europe. What are the implications of that in terms of migration? If convergence occurs between European countries and the US and high-income countries in general, something that we have observed over the Second World War or post-Second World War period, then Europe is going to catch up, and I predict that emigration rates will decrease in Europe. So what you have today in Portugal is maybe a short spell, according to this model, okay? And you see that the brain drain of, it's not brain drain, it's global migration rate here, global emigration rate of Europe will decrease from 5.9 to 5.2. And in Portugal, 16 to 13. So brain drain will still be there, but at a slightly lower level. What about the other countries of the world, or the other regions of the world? So less brain drain. So here it's, in bold character, it's the migration rate of high-skilled people. In standard character, it's the migration rate of all workers. Okay? So if you look at brain drain, Australia, 11, 7.5. Brain drain will decrease. North America, almost constant. Latin America, slight increase. Europe, decrease, as I showed before. Asia, a decrease, which is only due to China and India. In the rest of Asia, we predict an increase in brain drain and emigration in general. But Africa is key. In Africa, the brain drain, 16% today, 26% on average in the end of the 21st century. Just, you know, extrapolating the trends in total factor productivity that we have observed in the past and fitting the UN projections in terms of population. So the share of Africa increases, okay? What about immigration in the destination countries? In non-EU countries, immigration, so let's skip this. These are the BRICS, they converge, so their immigration rate will increase a bit, but they are not very attractive today. So except Russia, things are not very important here. But for the rest of the main destinations of the world, we predict something very stable. Not a big increase in immigration in the US, in Canada, in Australia. In the US, it increases a bit and then decreases a bit, you see? In the other countries, it increases a bit or decreases a bit. But the model shows that. In Europe, it's something very different. The average immigration rate, according to this model, will rise from 7.5% to 17.2%. A big increase in immigration at constant immigration policy. In Portugal, I have a very low number from the census that your statistical institute gave me in 2000, so maybe before the regularization of the Ukrainians and plenty of people who arrived in 2001. So I have a very low number, but if it's 3 or 4, it will be multiplied by 3. In the UK, 9 to 28. In France, 9 to 20. So we predict a very big increase in the migration pressure in Europe, and the reasons are very simple. The EU15 today is the main destination for Africa. The trends in TFP and income shows that Africa is diverging, will be poorer and poorer. And the demographic share of Africa is going to increase and be multiplied by 2.5 or 3. So one of the big challenges for Europe is this economic and demographic prospect for Africa. Okay? We predict in this baseline a big increase in the migration pressure. Last thing, you can tell me, okay, but your predictions, your projections are very sensitive to the scenarios that you have used, all the hypotheses that you have used. This is usually what people are telling me. Okay, I'm going to show you 6 alternative scenarios. For the BRICS, I divide their long-run productivity by 2. Instead of catching up with the US, they will reach 40% of the US TFP. So a pessimistic projections for the BRIC in terms of TFP, productivity and technology. In Africa, I predict divergence. Let me predict a partial convergence. Okay, so I multiply the long-run TFP of Africa by 2. So Africa will not catch up, but will grow slightly more rapidly than high-income countries. Partial convergence. Sociodemographic. Assume that child labor decreases by 20%, which is very important for Africa and poor countries. So this reduces the fertility and population growth a lot in developing countries. Higher education everywhere. And 2 extreme scenarios. The US close their border, become very, very restrictive in terms of immigration, just to show if it changes a lot, my predictions. Or China and India catching up with the US, become as attractive as the US in terms of linguistic characteristics, geographic characteristics. So a big shock in terms of immigration to these countries. Does it change our predictions? It changed the world population. Here you have the world population from 2000 to over the 21st century in perspective with the data from the 20th and 19th century. Okay? And here you have a zoom on this period and the deviation from the baseline. If the BRICS do not converge, the population of the world will be much bigger, 30%. If Africa converges partly or control its fertility, population growth, the world population could be 15 to 25% lower. So the world population prospects are strongly depending on this. Big changes in the world economy. World GDP per worker. No, it's not population, it's income per worker at the world level. Again, data from Madison's, from the 19th and 20th century, and then my scenarios. If the BRICS are not converging, big drop in income per worker. The BRIC, it's 1/3 of the world. If Africa is converging economically or control its fertility, plus 15, 20% of income per per worker in the world. So the world prospects are strongly depending on that. What about migration? I skip this. Are my results robust to that? This is my prediction of the world migration rate across all the scenarios. Very stable, very small changes. So my model fits very well the fact that the world migration rate has been evolving very smoothly with low variations in the past. The only exception is that if China and India become as attractive as the US and converges to the US, then it's like the discovery of the new world, you know? The world migration rate would double, but this is a very extreme scenario. In the other scenarios, the migration rate fits very well what we observed in the past, okay? And I fit very well what I showed you before, the link between population and migration. Except in the extreme scenario for China and India, my model replicates very well that at the world level, or at the level of developing countries in terms of immigration, migration is supply-driven. When the population doubles, immigration doubles, at least at constant migration policies. Okay, so I'm very happy with the property of my model, macroeconomic properties of my model. You could say it's not the right model and so on, but when we see that, we do not force that, we have that as an outcome of the model, we can have some confidence in the model. What about the sensitivity of my predictions? For non-EU countries, I remind you that what I expected in 2100 was very close to what I had today. So very stable migration rate. It's still the case. Whatever the scenario, I have very stable immigration rates in non-EU countries. Of course, if the US becomes very restrictive, then in the US only, I will have a big drop in immigration. But otherwise, things are very stable. So this is a very robust result. And for Europe, I predicted a very big increase in immigration from 7.5 to 17.2 in the baseline. So this is the value in the early 22nd century. This is sensitive, of course. If Africa partly converges, this pressure will decrease by 3 percentage points. If Africa controls its fertility and population growth, this will also decrease the migration pressure in Europe by 3 percentage points. So this migration pressure to Europe is highly sensitive to what happens in Africa. And to a lesser extent to what happens in the BRICS, in emerging countries. But in all scenarios, the migration pressure increases in the EU15. From this 7.5 to something which is between 14 and 18%, at least at constant immigration policies, constant immigration restrictions. So this increase in the migration pressure to Europe is something that I really believe in. Summary. Current debates on migration. Immigration is a hot topic. You know that. Most citizens in rich countries want to reduce it. Immigration is an increasing source of concern. And in Portugal, it's the same thing, okay? You have a lower immigration rate, but you have the same trends in terms of, dynamics of immigration. And you have apparently a strong opposition to increase migration. This is what the survey showed at the beginning. And for immigration, you have also the same trends, a large and increasing immigration, and a very strongly increasing selection of your immigrants, and this is something problematic for your economy, I confess. What does the future hold? You know my economic demographic prospect. I assume I reproduce the fact that the share of Africa is going to increase. This is something that nobody is denying, okay? The share of Africa will be multiplied by 2 to 3. Convergence between high-income countries, I may be optimistic for your country, I don't know, but I believe in it. I believe that what you have today is a bad spell, which could last maybe 10, 15, 20 years, but in the very long run, what we observed is something more optimistic. Takeoff of the BRICS, stagnation or partial convergence of Africa. If it's the case, the brain drain, emigration from Europe will be declining, and emigration from Africa will be increasing, and remittances will be a very important source of funding for Africa in the future. What about immigration? Stable immigration rates in non-EU countries, increasing migration pressure to the EU. And the cause is really Africa. Okay? So, of course, the magnitude of this change is uncertain. The evolution of productivity, the evolution of the demography matters a lot for Europe. For Europe, the immigration rate on average will increase from 7.5 to 14 to 18 under my set of scenarios. And for Portugal, maybe I underestimate the level of immigration in 2000. I have 2.1 in the data that were sent to me by your institute. But for Portugal, we move from this to a very wide range. If Africa converges, the pressure in Portugal will not be that much. If Africa does not converge and has a large population growth, you could multiply by 3 to 4 your immigration pressure. Maybe you like it, but maybe you dislike it. This I don't know. So the main message of this presentation is that, okay, you care today about immigration. You are probably pessimistic. I'm more optimistic about immigration. I'm much more pessimistic in terms of immigration. I'm done. I'm much more pessimistic about immigration. And for that reason, the EU should really care about what happens in Africa. Not because we are altruistic, but because the connection between Africa and Europe are so strong that if Africa does not take off, if Africa continues to grow like that demographically, inevitably what we have today in Lampedusa, in all these border regions of Europe, is nothing compared to what we could have in the future. Okay? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We will have now the closing with the Secretary of State, Dr. Pedro Lomba, and then we will have a moment of questions to Professor Frédéric Docquier.
Muito obrigado, meu caro José Cesário, professor Rui Pena Pires, Monsieur Frédéric Docquier. Começo por agradecer aqui a oportunidade. Eu como sei que há questões e há aqui um período que vocês gostariam de abrir com o convidado, tinha aqui um texto, mas vou abreviar um pouco o que aqui tenho, até pelo adiantado da hora, e se calhar circunscrever aquilo que eu queria dizer a 3 ou 4 notas. Eu, em primeiro lugar, acho que, pela ocasião, é justo dizer que o país tem, hoje, um conjunto de instituições fortes que têm estudado, melhorado o conhecimento que nós temos sobre as migrações, tanto da perspectiva da imigração como da perspectiva da imigração. E a circunstância de nós termos um observatório para a imigração e também um observatório para a imigração é prova disso mesmo. Julgo que a cooperação entre estas duas instituições é uma necessidade, como é a cooperação entre políticas de imigração e políticas de imigração, mas penso que é justo fazer esta nota e esta iniciativa é prova disso mesmo. Muitas vezes há uma grande demagogia, tornou-se às vezes moeda corrente no discurso público, sempre que alguém quer dar um exemplo de má despesa pública, e eu não tenho dúvidas que há má despesa pública, alguém fala num observatório. É uma coisa puramente demagógica que às vezes é utilizada, mas, quer dizer, na verdade, acho que os observatórios são absolutamente fundamentais se tomarem decisões políticas e, inclusivamente, eu tenho defendido até uma maior proximidade entre este tipo de estruturas e o processo de decisão política, já o disse em várias ocasiões. A outra nota é que nós temos hoje e às vezes é um motivo de alguma frustração, até para quem tem de tomar decisões nesta área, é que nos últimos anos é verdade que o tema da imigração se tornou um tema muito mais presente no espaço público do que o tema da imigração. Imigração com I. E acho que a forma como o tema da imigração muitas vezes surgiu e circulou no espaço público foi ocasionalmente da pior maneira possível. Foi transformada numa arma de arremesso político entre uns e outros. Agora não interessa também investigar aprofundadamente as causas disso, mas foi penso eu, pejada daqui e dali de inúmeras distorções que não nos permitiram debater o assunto, às vezes, de uma forma mais ponderada ou de uma forma ou devidamente ou mais apropriadamente assente em dados e em factos concretos. Eu tenho, aliás, alguns exemplos disso, porque isso prejudica depois a forma como o tema da imigração em Portugal é também avaliado do ponto de vista político, porque aqui há uns tempos, penso que foi o professor Rui Pena Pires, disse uma coisa que é correta, disse que Portugal, o saldo migratório é mostra disso mesmo, deixou de atrair imigração com I, tenho que sempre dizer isto, não vai haver imigração com I. E é de facto correto, o nosso saldo migratório a partir de 2010 é quase negativo, em 2011 já é negativo, e quando nós tentamos, no fundo, vamos dizer, bom, então uma das coisas que temos que fazer é ser mais proativos na captação de imigração. E depois aparecem, é uma tragédia, porque depois aparecem declarações a dizerem que o país precisa de captar mais imigração e imediatamente a recepção que isto tem junto à opinião pública não é a recepção mais positiva, porque a destruição no debate público sobre a imigração é de tal maneira grande que assumir do ponto de vista político até uma coisa que a nós nos parece uma evidência, que é a necessidade do país para corrigir o seu déficit demográfico, para renovar a sua população, para competir nestes fluxos de qualificados que o professor Docquier aqui descreveu, se torna necessário desenvolver políticas que atraiam estes fluxos, como tem acontecido. Esta universidade recebe muitos estudantes internacionais e confirma exatamente a necessidade desta proatividade. E por isso, no entanto, quando se fala nisto, há uma reserva na opinião pública, em alguns setores, diria mais da opinião publicada do que da opinião pública. E, portanto, daí a necessidade destes debates, daí a necessidade de nós, de facto, falarmos cada vez mais sobre estes temas. Nós sabemos, inclusivamente, posso até, se quiserem dar mais um exemplo às vezes desta destruição. Quando nós fizemos aqui há pouco tempo as mudanças no Alto Comissariado para o focar no tema das migrações e para no fundo, tornar claro que não há apenas hoje migrações laborais, há migrações económicas, há migrações de consumo, há migrações de empreendedores, há migrações de estudantes, há uma diversidade muito grande de migrações. Uma das críticas que recebemos, ele não está aqui hoje, uma pessoa que é muito empenhada no tema, o professor Jorge Malheiros, uma das críticas que recebemos é que nos estávamos a focar excessivamente neste conceito do imigrante talentoso ou empreendedor, porque esses fluxos, de acordo com este entendimento, seriam minoritários. ainda minoritários face às migrações laborais. Exatamente. É verdade que são menos expressivos do que as migrações clássicas, ou de trabalhadores, ou as migrações laborais, ou o reagrupamento familiar. É verdade que são menos expressivos, não há nenhuma dúvida, mas não era essa a questão. Quer dizer, a questão aqui para nós é que eles, como o professor Docquier demonstrou, não só estes fluxos, estes movimentos não têm parado de aumentar, nos últimos anos têm aumentado significativamente, como as estimativas que existem para as próximas décadas é que continuarão objetivamente a aumentar. A questão que se coloca a quem tem que tomar decisões políticas nesta área é, no fundo, esta. Deve ou não deve a política migratória do Estado português reconhecer que há hoje uma dimensão muito importante nas migrações que tem a ver com os qualificados. E deve ou não deve procurar conhecer melhor essa realidade. E deve ou não deve procurar, em articulação dentro do Estado e da administração pública, desenvolver um conjunto de ações estratégicas que permitam também promover uma maior captação, usa a palavra, desta imigração. Deve ou não deve ter instrumentos? E a resposta é, penso eu, positiva, sob pena de um Estado como Portugal ignorar esta realidade e continuar a tratar o fenómeno migratório com as mesmas políticas que usava nos anos 90, quando ainda por cima o país atrai hoje menos imigração dita laboral, e quando o país tem hoje um saldo migratório negativo. E, portanto, acho eu, não se tratava de, ou não se trata de, bom, agora vamos só pensar nos qualificados. Nada disso. Do que se trata é de corrigir este desequilíbrio que é, nós montamos fundamentalmente uma política para um determinado perfil migratório e agora temos de, embora saibamos que esse perfil não é o perfil maioritário, é um perfil, mas que precisa de ter respostas e de ser melhor compreendido, e precisa da ação política que intervenha sobre esse assunto. E com isto estava a dizer algumas coisas que até nem tinha no papel, mas que me lembrei de dizer. Isto tem que ver agora, terceira nota, é só uma terceira e uma quarta nota, tem que ver com um ponto que eu também acho importantíssimo, que tem que ver com o país, que é, nós temos um problema económico que pode ser traduzido de muitas maneiras. Uns com visões, uns dirão que é um problema de competitividade, outros dirão que é, enfim. Mas nós temos um problema que existe não só em Portugal como noutros países, que tem que ver com a nossa crise de competências, se quiserem, a nossa crise de qualificações. Nós sabemos que em áreas da nova economia, em áreas que têm que ver, por exemplo, com o mercado, com a economia digital, com as tecnologias de informação, o déficit de competências, o déficit de skills, o déficit de qualificações começa a ser cada vez mais sentido e é um fortíssimo travão à inovação e à produtividade e à competitividade. Sabemos isso. E sabemos que este déficit de competências é um déficit que é dificultado pela saída também de alguns dos nossos quadros qualificados que uns também saem porque encontram, de facto, noutros países oportunidades e até remunerações com as quais nós, em Portugal, dificilmente, na fase da nossa situação económica, dificilmente conseguimos competir. Sabemos isso, sabemos que não somos os únicos. Os alemães também têm hoje, já este ano, um déficit de, se estes números estiverem corretos, 117 mil trabalhadores qualificados nas áreas da ciência, tecnologia, engenharia e matemática. Prevê-se um agravamento para 1 milhão de qualificados em 2020. E, portanto, nós temos isso. Nós temos uma coisa que é que quando eu comecei a estudar, toda a gente dizia, bom, vai para a informática de gestão porque aquilo é que está a dar. Eu, por acaso, não fui para Direito. E descobri que não estava a dar. Bom, mas vai para a Informática de Gestão. E, de facto, na altura, havia gente aí para a Informática de Gestão. Mas hoje descobrimos que temos um déficit de pessoas em Informática de Gestão, com qualificações em Informática de Gestão. Temos um enorme déficit. Foram para Direito, exatamente. Foram para Direito e deviam ter ido para a Informática de Gestão. Bom, mas quer dizer, olhamos para estas áreas, a economia digital, que é uma área, os digital jobs, que hoje está muito até na agenda, e verificamos, bom, temos aqui de facto um grande caminho, que tem que ser percorrido com o sistema de ensino, com o sistema de educação, tem que ser percorrido com uma aposta nova no capital humano, nos fundos europeus estamos a fazer isso, mas que depois também precisa das migrações. Também precisa das migrações. O meu colega José Cesário sabe bem, porque tem feito um trabalho também a esse nível, precisa também das migrações, precisa também de perceber como é que nós podemos conhecer melhor os migrantes. Eu, evidentemente, olho mais para os migrantes estrangeiros, mas acho que, por exemplo, nós temos um problema que temos de corrigir, temos de melhorar melhor, que é como é que articulamos a política de emprego com a política migratória. Quer dizer, o país congelou, nos últimos anos, a entrada de estrangeiros em Portugal para o mercado de trabalho. Há razões para isso, até do ponto de vista político e económico, há razões para isso. Mas ninguém acredita que não são necessários imigrantes para o mercado de trabalho. Isso é um absurdo. Aliás, eles são mesmo necessários. Tanto são necessários que há setores inteiros da economia que não existem sem mão de obra providenciada por imigrantes, sabemos disso. E como é que se faz esta articulação? Uma das coisas que nós estamos a desenvolver é para promover melhor este encontro que está a ser desenvolvido pelo Alto Comissariado para as Migrações. Aqui contamos aqui com a presença do Sr. Alto Comissário. É para fazer este melhor match entre emprego, qualificações, oferta migratória, é promover respostas ao nível local. Há um piloto que vai ser agora desenvolvido, que passa pela introdução de uma figura nova, de um instrumento novo, que são os planos locais de integração de imigrantes, que serão coordenados pelos municípios pela primeira vez. Há aqui uma grande descentralização das políticas locais, da política migratória a um nível local, e através destes planos, que serão até da iniciativa dos municípios, pretende-se uma melhor cooperação e trabalho entre associações de imigrantes, entre municípios, entre empresas. Isso é uma das coisas que as práticas internacionais nos mostram, é que se queremos melhorar o conhecimento e a forma como os imigrantes podem responder ao mercado de trabalho, temos de ouvir e trabalhar com as empresas e com as associações empresariais. Não vale a pena fazer isto num instituto qualquer em Lisboa, que não conhece, que não sabe o mercado, que não pode responder eficazmente às necessidades que esse mercado tem. É um instrumento que nos parece importante, decisivo, para promover esta melhor articulação entre política de emprego, recursos, competências, skills e a forma como as migrações podem prestar aqui um papel. Depois há uma outra, e esta é a quarta nota que eu deixo, pedindo a vossa generosidade e paciência, que tem que ver com o meu colega José Cesário sabe muito bem, ele tem feito um trabalho excepcional de ligação à diáspora portuguesa e às comunidades portuguesas, não só no plano cultural, mas no plano económico. E há todo um potencial extraordinário a esse respeito em olhar para a nossa diáspora, para os nossos imigrantes e muitos deles com qualificações diversas, e há hoje uma nova imigração mais qualificada, com um perfil diferente, etc. E depois há aqui uma dimensão, aí que nós temos conversado também, há uma nova dimensão muito importante para a política nesta área, que é a dimensão do regresso, ou do retorno, ou do apoio ao regresso. Quer dizer, um país como Portugal, que precisa de migrantes, que precisa das migrações para corrigir todos estes déficits, não só o déficit de recursos, mas também o déficit, não vou alongar muito mais, mas também o déficit demográfico que ambos conhecemos. Um país como Portugal, quando tem de responder à necessidade de trazer mais migrantes para resolver todos estes problemas, pode e deve olhar, em primeiro lugar, para os seus próprios cidadãos que estão no exterior. E pode e deve levar a cabo ações concretas no apoio desses cidadãos ao retorno, ao regresso. Quem emigrou deve poder ter condições para regressar ao país exatamente com a mesma liberdade com que partiu. Os incentivos que nós damos aos estrangeiros para virem para Portugal devem ser exatamente os mesmos incentivos que nós damos aos cidadãos portugueses que estão lá fora. Isto é um ponto muito importante. E isto passa, de facto, do nosso ponto de vista, por desenvolver esta componente do apoio ao retorno, do apoio ao regresso. Este trabalho é um trabalho que pode e deve ser feito pelos departamentos, pelos organismos públicos, que uns acompanham tradicionalmente as comunidades portuguesas no estrangeiro, outros que acompanham as comunidades estrangeiras que estão no nosso país. Há pouco o senhor professor Frédéric Docquier falou do Paul Collier. Quando o Paul Collier, o grande investigador, esteve cá em Portugal, numa conferência, um dos conselhos que ele deu a Portugal foi exatamente esse. Foi um conselho, tem tudo a ver, aliás, com duas mensagens importantes que o professor Frédéric Docquier nos deixou hoje. A primeira foi, quando olharem para a diáspora, para os migrantes, olhem primeiro para os imigrantes portugueses, neste sentido. Não é? Quer dizer, eles são culturalmente fáceis de integrar, devem ser o primeiro, digamos, reservatório de pessoas para cujas qualificações devemos olhar. E depois, a questão da África é muito importante, que ele aqui mencionou. Fundamental, por causa disto, melhorar e desenvolver a nossa cooperação migratória com os países africanos e, no nosso caso, em particular, com os países de língua oficial portuguesa. Isso é um tema também muito importante, onde há grandes desafios. E também foi uma coisa que nós quisemos, com a reforma que nós fizemos do Alto Comissariado, nos tornar claro que nós também gostaríamos de intervir nesse terreno das migrações em contexto lusófono. Meus caros amigos, isto agora podia continuar, mas isto agora tenho de terminar, já chega. E queria só dizer, mais uma vez, muito obrigado. Eu acho que este debate é de facto fascinante, muito importante. Saúdo os senhores professores, os senhores investigadores. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if you understood. No. Okay. No problem. E por isso, mais uma vez, agradeço muito a vossa atenção. Muito obrigado.
Obrigada. Muito obrigada.